June 23, 1941. Just one day after Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest invasions in history, German armored divisions were already advancing deep into Soviet territory. Columns of tanks stretched for miles, engines roaring, tracks grinding against the earth as they pushed forward with confidence. For months, perhaps even years, German commanders had prepared for this moment. Their strategy had worked across Europe, and there was little reason to believe this campaign would be any different. Blitzkrieg had become their greatest weapon. Fast-moving tanks, coordinated air strikes, and rapid infantry support had overwhelmed every opponent so far. Poland had fallen quickly. France had collapsed in weeks. Even experienced armies had struggled to react in time. Speed and coordination had become the defining elements of German success. And now, the same strategy was being applied on an even larger scale. At first, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Soviet defenses were disorganized, communication lines were disrupted, and German forces advanced rapidly across vast distances. Entire units were surrounded, supply depots were captured, and the Red Army appeared to be retreating under pressure. German soldiers believed they were witnessing another decisive campaign. Then, something unexpected appeared on the battlefield. During one engagement, a group of German panzer tanks spotted a Soviet tank moving toward their position. It did not appear particularly unusual at first glance. It was not significantly larger than other tanks they had encountered, and it advanced steadily without hesitation. The German crews opened fire. Their shells hit the target directly. But nothing happened. There was no visible damage. No explosion. No sign that the tank had been affected at all. Instead, it continued moving forward, as if the impact had meant nothing. Confused, the German crews fired again. And again. The result was the same. Shells struck the armor and deflected away, leaving the tank almost untouched. For the first time, experienced crews who had fought across Europe found themselves facing something they did not fully understand. That tank was the T-34. And in that moment, the nature of the war began to change. Up until that point, German tanks had dominated most engagements. Even when facing stronger opponents, their tactics, coordination, and speed allowed them to gain the upper hand. But the T-34 introduced a combination of features that challenged this dominance. One of its most important innovations was sloped armor. Unlike traditional tanks with flat armor plates, the T-34 used angled surfaces. This design increased the effective thickness of the armor without significantly increasing weight. When a shell struck the surface, it was more likely to deflect rather than penetrate. This was why German shells were bouncing off. Another critical feature was its mobility. The T-34 was designed to operate in harsh conditions. Its wide tracks distributed weight more effectively, allowing it to move across mud, snow, and uneven terrain with greater ease. On the Eastern Front, where weather conditions could change rapidly, this provided a major advantage. While other tanks struggled, the T-34 kept moving. And movement was essential in war. Then there was its firepower. Equipped with a powerful 76mm gun, the T-34 could destroy most German tanks at typical combat ranges. This meant it was not only difficult to stop, but also highly dangerous in return. It could absorb damage. And it could deliver it. For German forces, this created a serious problem. Their standard tanks, such as the Panzer III and early versions of the Panzer IV, were not designed to face an opponent like this. Their guns were not powerful enough to reliably penetrate the T-34's armor at a distance, forcing them to move closer to engage. This increased risk. Closer range meant greater exposure. And greater exposure meant higher losses. At first, commanders believed this was an isolated issue. Perhaps a new model, not yet widely deployed. But as more reports came in, a pattern emerged. The T-34 was not rare. It was becoming common. Encounters increased, and each one reinforced the same conclusion. German units were facing a tank that not only matched their capabilities but exceeded them in key areas. This forced them to adapt quickly, both tactically and mentally. The psychological impact was significant. Confidence, which had been a defining characteristic of German forces, began to shift toward caution. Crews approached engagements more carefully, aware that their usual advantages no longer guaranteed success. This change affected decision-making. It slowed momentum, and in a strategy built on speed, even small delays could have large consequences. At the same time, Soviet forces began to recognize the value of the T-34. Initially, coordination was not always consistent. Early in the invasion, many units were caught off guard, and communication between formations was limited. But as the situation evolved, the T-34 became a central part of Soviet resistance. It was not just a tank. It was a tool for adaptation. As more units received the T-34, its presence on the battlefield increased. Engagements became more frequent, and German forces had to confront the reality that this was not a temporary challenge. It was a permanent one. Meanwhile, the scale of the Eastern Front continued to expand. Distances were vast, supply lines stretched thin, and maintaining coordination across such a large area became increasingly difficult. German forces were still advancing, but the pace was beginning to slow. Resistance was growing, conditions were becoming harsher, and the T-34 was becoming a factor in both. It did not stop the German advance immediately. But it changed how that advance unfolded. Every encounter required more planning. Every engagement carried more risk. And every delay reduced the effectiveness of blitzkrieg. By late summer 1941, the initial phase of the invasion had already begun to shift. German forces were still moving forward, but the sense of inevitability that had defined earlier campaigns was no longer present. Instead, there was uncertainty. Because for the first time, they had encountered a machine that challenged not just their equipment, but their entire way of fighting. The T-34 was not just another tank. It was a turning point. And as the war continued, its impact would only grow. Because this was only the beginning. The first encounters with the T-34 did more than surprise German forces. They forced a shift in perception that spread quickly across the Eastern Front. Reports moved from frontline units to command headquarters, and the message was consistent. There was a new Soviet tank, and existing German weapons were struggling to deal with it effectively. At first, some officers believed these reports were exaggerated. After all, the German army had faced unexpected resistance before and had adapted. Their confidence was built on a series of rapid victories, and the assumption was that any new threat could be analyzed and countered in time. But as more units reported similar experiences, the pattern became undeniable. The T-34 was not an isolated anomaly. It was appearing in increasing numbers. German panzer divisions began to encounter it more frequently, and each encounter reinforced the same conclusion. Standard tactics were no longer reliable. Engagement distances that once provided safety were now dangerous. Shots that should have disabled an enemy tank were failing to penetrate. This created confusion at multiple levels. Tank crews, trained to trust their equipment and tactics, found themselves in situations where those assumptions no longer applied. Commanders, responsible for maintaining momentum, had to reconsider how to deploy their forces. Even engineers and planners began to question whether current designs were sufficient. The battlefield itself amplified these challenges. The Eastern Front was unlike anything Germany had experienced in Western Europe. The distances were vast, the infrastructure limited, and the terrain unpredictable. Roads were often unpaved, turning into mud during rain and becoming frozen in winter. Movement depended not only on mechanical performance but on adaptability. The T-34 excelled in this environment. Its wide tracks distributed weight more effectively, allowing it to move across soft ground where other vehicles struggled. Its engine, while not perfect, was designed with simplicity and durability in mind. This meant it could operate in conditions that caused frequent breakdowns in more complex machines. German tanks, by comparison, were more sensitive to these conditions. Engines required careful maintenance, tracks could become stuck, and mechanical issues increased as the environment became harsher. This reduced operational efficiency and slowed advances. In contrast, the T-34 maintained mobility. And mobility, once again, proved to be a decisive factor. But the advantages of the T-34 were not limited to design alone. Production played a crucial role. The Soviet Union had recognized early in the war that industrial capacity would be a determining factor. Factories were relocated eastward, away from the front lines, and production was reorganized to prioritize efficiency. The T-34 was designed with this in mind. It was not overly complex. It was not dependent on rare materials. It could be produced in large numbers. This allowed Soviet factories to increase output even under difficult conditions. As the war progressed, more T-34s entered service, reinforcing existing units and replacing losses. For German forces, this created a new kind of pressure. It was no longer just about facing a superior tank. It was about facing a superior tank repeatedly. Each engagement required effort, coordination, and risk. Even when a T-34 was destroyed, the cost could be significant. And as more appeared on the battlefield, the cumulative effect began to influence the pace of operations. German commanders began to adjust their tactics. Anti-tank guns were positioned more carefully, aiming for weaker areas such as the sides or rear of the T-34. Coordinated attacks were used to overwhelm individual units. Air support was called in when available, targeting concentrations of Soviet armor. These adaptations helped, but they did not eliminate the problem. Because the underlying issue remained. The T-34 had changed the balance of armored warfare. At the same time, the psychological impact of these encounters continued to grow. Confidence, once a defining feature of German forces, became more cautious. Tank crews approached engagements with greater awareness of risk. Commanders considered alternative strategies, sometimes slowing advances to avoid unnecessary losses. This shift affected momentum, and momentum was central to blitzkrieg. The strategy relied on rapid movement, constant pressure, and the ability to disrupt enemy defenses before they could stabilize. Any delay, any hesitation, reduced its effectiveness. The presence of the T-34 contributed to these delays. Not by stopping advances entirely, but by complicating them. Each engagement required more time, more planning, more coordination, and over the vast distances of the Eastern Front, these small changes accumulated. Meanwhile, Soviet forces continued to improve their use of the T-34. Early in the invasion, coordination between units was inconsistent. Communication systems were disrupted, and many units were forced to react independently. But as the situation stabilized, training improved and command structures adapted. Tank units began to operate more effectively. They coordinated with infantry, supported defensive positions, and launched counterattacks when opportunities arose. The T-34 became not just a strong individual machine, but part of a larger operational system. This increased its impact significantly. Because a powerful weapon becomes far more effective when used within a coordinated strategy. By late 1941, the cumulative effect of these factors was becoming clear. German advances continued, but at a slower pace. Resistance increased, and the initial expectation of a rapid victory began to fade. The war was no longer following the pattern of previous campaigns. It was becoming something else. Something longer, more complex, more demanding. And within this new reality, the T-34 played a central role. It did not win the war on its own. But it forced change. It forced adaptation. And most importantly, it challenged the assumption that German armored superiority would remain unchallenged. That assumption had been one of the foundations of early success. Now, it was no longer certain. And once certainty is lost, everything begins to shift. Because war is not only fought with weapons. It is also fought with expectations. And the T-34 had changed both. As the months of 1941 came to an end, the Eastern Front transformed into something far more brutal than anyone had anticipated. The rapid advances of summer gave way to a grinding, unforgiving struggle. Autumn rains turned roads into deep mud, trapping vehicles and slowing movement to a crawl. Then winter arrived, bringing freezing temperatures that pushed both men and machines to their limits. For German forces, this was a turning point. Their strategy had been built on speed and momentum, but the environment itself now resisted them. Engines struggled to start in the cold, lubricants thickened, and mechanical failures became more frequent. Vehicles that had performed reliably in earlier campaigns began to show their limitations. But the challenges were not equal on both sides. The T-34, designed with harsh conditions in mind, continued to operate more effectively than many German tanks. Its engine, while not immune to the cold, was less sensitive to extreme temperatures. Its wide tracks allowed it to move across snow and frozen ground where other vehicles struggled. This gave Soviet forces a crucial advantage. Not necessarily in firepower alone, but in the ability to keep moving. And in war, the ability to move often determines the ability to fight. As German advances slowed near Moscow, Soviet forces began to reorganize and prepare for counter-offensives. Reinforcements arrived, defensive positions were strengthened, and the Red Army started to recover from the initial shock of the invasion. The T-34 became central to this recovery. It was used not only in defense but also in counterattacks, striking at German units that had advanced too far or become overextended. These engagements were often intense and unpredictable, with both sides adapting their tactics in real time. German crews, now more familiar with the T-34, developed methods to counter it. They aimed for weaker points, such as the sides and rear of the tank. They coordinated attacks between multiple vehicles, attempting to overwhelm individual T-34s. Anti-tank guns were deployed more strategically, positioned to take advantage of terrain and visibility. These tactics had some success. But they required precision and coordination. And under the conditions of the Eastern Front, maintaining that level of control was difficult. At the same time, Soviet forces continued to improve. Training programs were expanded, and experience from earlier battles was applied to new situations. Tank crews became more skilled, communication improved, and units began to operate with greater cohesion. The T-34 was no longer just a strong machine. It was part of an increasingly effective system. This combination of design and usage amplified its impact. Because a weapon's effectiveness depends not only on its capabilities, but on how it is used. By early 1942, the war had clearly shifted from a rapid campaign to a prolonged conflict. German forces were still capable of launching offensives, but they no longer had the same level of control. Each operation required more resources, more planning, and more time. The assumption of quick victory had been replaced by the reality of sustained warfare. Within this context, the role of the T-34 became even more significant. It was not just influencing individual battles. It was influencing the pace of the war. German engineers and planners recognized this. Reports from the front were analyzed, and efforts began to develop new tanks that could counter the T-34 more effectively. Designs were proposed, tested, and refined, leading to projects that would eventually result in tanks like the Panther. But development takes time, and while new designs were being prepared, the war continued. On the battlefield, German forces had to rely on existing equipment. This created a gap between current capabilities and future solutions. A gap that the T-34 continued to exploit. Meanwhile, Soviet production continued to increase. Factories, relocated to safer areas, operated continuously to produce more tanks. The design of the T-34, which balanced effectiveness with simplicity, allowed for efficient manufacturing. This meant that losses could be replaced quickly, maintaining pressure on German forces. The scale of production became a decisive factor. Because even the most advanced weapon can be overwhelmed if it faces superior numbers. And the T-34 was not only effective. It was numerous. This combination created a new kind of challenge. German forces were no longer just facing a better tank. They were facing a system that could sustain itself. This had implications beyond individual battles. It affected strategy. It influenced planning. And it shaped expectations. The idea of a quick victory had already begun to fade. Now, it was being replaced by the realization that the war would require long-term commitment. More resources, more coordination, and more adaptation. The T-34 played a central role in this transition. It forced German forces to reconsider their approach to armored warfare. It influenced the development of new technologies. And it contributed to the shift from rapid offensives to prolonged conflict. By the middle of 1942, this shift was undeniable. The war had changed, and with it, the rules of engagement. The T-34 was not the only factor. But it was one of the most important. Because it demonstrated that superiority in one phase of the war did not guarantee superiority in the next. And in a conflict as complex as World War II, adaptation was everything. Those who adapted survived. Those who did not fell behind. And the T-34 ensured that adaptation was no longer optional. It was necessary. By the middle of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had entered a new phase, one defined not by rapid advances, but by endurance, adaptation, and scale. German forces were still capable of launching offensives, and their military structure remained effective in many areas. But the conditions had changed, and with those conditions came new challenges that could not be solved with speed alone. One of the most significant developments during this period was the growing realization within German command that the T-34 was not just a temporary obstacle, but a long-term factor that would shape the war moving forward. This realization forced a response. German engineers began to study captured T-34 tanks in detail. They analyzed its armor design, its mobility, and its overall structure. What they found confirmed what soldiers had already experienced on the battlefield. The T-34 was not superior in every aspect, but it achieved a balance that made it extremely effective. It combined protection, mobility, and firepower in a way that existing German tanks did not. This led to a shift in German tank design philosophy. Instead of focusing primarily on incremental improvements, there was now a need for a more comprehensive redesign. The result of this effort would eventually become the Panther tank, a vehicle heavily influenced by the T-34's design principles. Sloped armor was adopted. More powerful guns were developed. Mobility was reconsidered. But while these developments were underway, the war did not pause. On the battlefield, German forces had to continue fighting with the equipment they already had. This created a critical gap. A gap between current capability and future improvement. And during this gap, the T-34 continued to dominate key aspects of armored warfare. At the same time, Soviet forces were not standing still. They were learning, adapting, and improving their use of the T-34 with each engagement. Early coordination issues were gradually resolved, and tank units became more integrated with infantry and artillery support. This increased their effectiveness significantly. The T-34 was no longer just a strong individual tank. It was part of a coordinated system. And that system was becoming increasingly efficient. This was especially evident during large-scale battles. As operations grew in size, the number of T-34s involved in engagements increased dramatically. Instead of isolated encounters, German forces now faced formations of these tanks, supported by other units and coordinated within broader strategies. This changed the nature of combat. It was no longer about individual superiority. It was about collective strength. And in this area, Soviet forces began to gain an advantage. One of the most significant examples of this shift occurred during the Battle of Stalingrad. While the battle is often remembered for its intense urban combat and strategic importance, it also highlighted the evolving role of armored warfare. The T-34 played a crucial role in supporting Soviet operations, both in defense and in counter-offensives. Its ability to operate in difficult conditions, combined with increasing numbers and improved coordination, allowed Soviet forces to maintain pressure on German units. This pressure was constant. It forced German forces to divide their attention. It reduced their ability to maintain initiative. And it contributed to the gradual shift in momentum. At the same time, logistical challenges continued to affect German operations. Supplying troops across vast distances became increasingly difficult. Fuel shortages, damaged infrastructure, and extended supply lines limited mobility and reduced operational flexibility. These challenges affected all units, including armored divisions. In contrast, Soviet forces operated closer to their industrial base. Their supply lines, while not without issues, were more stable relative to the front. This allowed them to sustain operations more effectively over time. The combination of production, logistics, and battlefield adaptation created a powerful system. And within that system, the T-34 was a central component. German forces responded as best they could. New tactics were developed, emphasizing coordination between different units. Anti-tank weapons were improved, and efforts were made to counter the advantages of the T-34 through strategic positioning and combined arms operations. These adaptations had an effect. But they did not fully resolve the problem. Because the underlying factors remained. The T-34 was still effective. It was still being produced in large numbers. And it was still being used within an increasingly efficient system. By late 1942, the cumulative effect of these factors had become clear. The war was no longer defined by rapid German victories. It was defined by sustained conflict. A conflict in which both sides had to adapt continuously. And in this environment, the T-34 played a defining role. It had influenced German tank design. It had altered battlefield tactics. And it had contributed to the shift in momentum on the Eastern Front. But perhaps its most important impact was more subtle. It changed expectations. German forces could no longer assume superiority in armored warfare. Every engagement required caution. Every decision carried greater weight. And every delay had consequences. This change in mindset was significant. Because war is not only fought with weapons and strategies. It is also fought with confidence and perception. And the T-34 had reshaped both. As the war moved into 1943, this transformation would become even more apparent. New tanks would enter the battlefield. New strategies would be tested. And new battles would determine the future of the conflict. But the influence of the T-34 would remain. Because it had already changed the rules. And once the rules change, everything else must follow. By 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had reached a critical point where both sides understood that the next major battles would shape the future of the conflict. The rapid movements of earlier campaigns had given way to carefully planned offensives, massive concentrations of forces, and battles that stretched across vast areas of land. Within this new phase of the war, armored warfare remained central, and the role of tanks became even more decisive. At the center of this transformation stood the T-34. By this stage, it was no longer a surprise. German forces had encountered it repeatedly, studied it, and adapted their tactics accordingly. But even with this experience, the challenge it posed had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown. Because the T-34 was no longer just an effective tank. It was now part of a system operating at full capacity. Soviet production had reached levels that were difficult for Germany to match. Factories worked continuously, producing tanks at a scale that ensured constant reinforcement of frontline units. Losses could be replaced quickly, allowing Soviet forces to maintain pressure even after heavy engagements. This was a critical advantage. Because in prolonged warfare, the ability to sustain losses and continue fighting often determines the outcome. At the same time, Soviet tactics continued to improve. Tank units were better coordinated with infantry, artillery, and air support. Operations were planned with greater precision, and communication between units became more effective. This allowed for larger, more coordinated offensives that maximized the strengths of the T-34. One of the most significant tests of this evolving system came during the Battle of Kursk. This battle would become one of the largest tank engagements in history, involving thousands of armored vehicles on both sides. German forces, aware of the growing strength of Soviet defenses, prepared a major offensive aimed at regaining initiative. They introduced new tanks, including the Panther and Tiger, designed in part to counter the T-34. These tanks featured heavier armor and more powerful guns, giving them an advantage in direct engagements. On paper, they represented a significant improvement over earlier designs. But the battlefield is not determined by specifications alone. When the battle began, German forces encountered deeply prepared Soviet defenses. Minefields, anti-tank positions, and layered defensive lines slowed their advance. Movement became difficult, and the effectiveness of new tanks was limited by the conditions they faced. At the same time, Soviet forces deployed large numbers of T-34s. These tanks, while not as heavily armored as the Tiger, were faster, more numerous, and easier to maintain. They operated in coordination with other units, exploiting weaknesses and maintaining pressure on German formations. The result was a battle defined by scale and endurance. German tanks achieved successes in certain engagements, but they were unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The complexity of the battlefield, combined with strong Soviet defenses and the sheer number of opposing tanks, reduced the effectiveness of their technological advantages. The T-34 played a central role in this outcome. Its reliability allowed it to operate consistently throughout the battle. Its mobility enabled it to respond quickly to changing conditions. And its numbers ensured that it remained a constant presence on the battlefield. This combination proved difficult to overcome. Because even when individual engagements favored German tanks, the overall balance remained in favor of Soviet forces. Kursk marked a turning point. It demonstrated that Germany could no longer rely on offensive operations to regain control of the Eastern Front. The failure to achieve a decisive victory shifted momentum further toward the Soviet Union, reinforcing the trend that had been developing over the previous years. In this new phase of the war, the role of the T-34 continued to expand. It was used in offensive operations, supporting advances across multiple fronts. It was deployed in defensive positions, strengthening lines against German counterattacks. And it remained a key element of Soviet strategy, integrated into a broader system that combined production, logistics, and coordination. German forces continued to adapt. New tactics were developed to counter the T-34, including improved anti-tank weapons and coordinated attacks involving multiple units. The introduction of advanced tanks provided some advantages, particularly in direct engagements. But these advantages were not enough to change the overall situation. Because the war had evolved beyond individual superiority. It had become a contest of systems. And in that contest, the Soviet system, supported by the T-34, was proving more effective. Another important factor was reliability. German tanks, especially newer models, were often complex and required significant maintenance. Mechanical issues were common, particularly under the demanding conditions of the Eastern Front. This reduced operational availability and limited the number of tanks that could be deployed at any given time. The T-34, by contrast, was simpler. It was not without flaws, but its design allowed for easier production and maintenance. This meant that more tanks could be kept in operational condition, increasing overall effectiveness. This difference became increasingly important as the war continued. Because in prolonged conflict, reliability and sustainability often outweigh raw performance. By the end of 1943, the impact of these factors was clear. German forces were increasingly on the defensive. Soviet forces were advancing, and the T-34 remained a central element in this shift. It had influenced the design of enemy tanks. It had shaped battlefield tactics. And it had contributed to the broader transformation of the war. But perhaps its most significant contribution was its consistency. It performed reliably across different conditions. It adapted to different roles. And it remained effective even as the war evolved. This consistency made it more than just a weapon. It made it a foundation. A foundation upon which Soviet strategy was built. And as the war moved into its final phase, that foundation would support the advances that ultimately determined the outcome. The T-34 had not ended the war. But it had helped shape the path toward its conclusion. And that path was becoming increasingly clear. By 1944, the balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted decisively. The period of uncertainty and adaptation was over. What had begun as a desperate defense had evolved into a sustained and coordinated offensive. Soviet forces were no longer reacting to German movements. They were driving the pace of the war. And at the center of this advance, once again, was the T-34. But this was no longer the same tank that had first shocked German forces in 1941. It had evolved. The introduction of the T-34-85 marked a significant improvement over earlier models. With a larger turret and a more powerful 85mm gun, it addressed one of the key weaknesses of the original design, its ability to engage heavier German tanks at longer distances. This upgrade changed the dynamics of armored combat. Where earlier T-34s had sometimes struggled against heavily armored opponents like the Panther and Tiger, the T-34-85 could now engage them more effectively. It did not eliminate the advantages of German tanks, but it reduced the gap significantly. At the same time, the core strengths of the T-34 remained. Mobility, reliability, ease of production. These qualities ensured that even as the design improved, it retained the characteristics that had made it so effective in the first place. This combination of improvement and consistency made the T-34-85 one of the most important tanks of the war's final phase. On the battlefield, its impact was immediate. Soviet offensives in 1944 were larger, more coordinated, and more ambitious than ever before. Operations were planned with precision, combining infantry, artillery, air support, and armored units into a unified system. The T-34-85 was a key part of this system. It supported breakthroughs, exploited gaps in enemy lines, and maintained pressure on retreating forces. Its mobility allowed it to advance rapidly once defenses were weakened, turning local successes into larger gains. German forces, now increasingly on the defensive, faced a different kind of challenge. Earlier in the war, they had relied on initiative. Now, they were reacting. This shift affected everything. Planning became more difficult, coordination became more reactive, and the ability to control the battlefield diminished. At the same time, German tank production continued, and advanced models like the Panther and Tiger remained formidable opponents. In direct engagements, these tanks could still outperform the T-34 in certain areas, particularly in terms of armor and long-range firepower. But these advantages came with limitations. They were complex. They required more maintenance, and they were produced in smaller numbers. This created a familiar pattern. German tanks were often superior individually. But Soviet tanks, especially the T-34-85, were more numerous and more consistently available. In large-scale operations, this difference mattered. Because battles were no longer decided by individual engagements. They were decided by the ability to sustain pressure across an entire front. And in this regard, the T-34 excelled. Another critical factor was logistics. Soviet supply lines, while not perfect, had become more stable and efficient as the war progressed. This allowed for consistent delivery of fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. Armored units could remain operational for longer periods, increasing their effectiveness. German supply lines, in contrast, were under constant strain. Retreating forces, damaged infrastructure, and increasing pressure from Allied bombing campaigns in the West all contributed to logistical challenges. This limited the ability to sustain operations and reduced overall effectiveness. Within this context, the T-34's design once again proved advantageous. Its relative simplicity meant that it could be repaired more easily. Parts could be replaced more quickly. and crews could return to action faster. This reduced downtime and increased operational availability. As Soviet forces advanced through Eastern Europe, the role of the T-34 expanded further. It was no longer just a battlefield asset. It became a symbol of momentum. Where the T-34 advanced, the front moved forward. This was particularly evident in large offensives, where armored units led breakthroughs and exploited weakened defenses. Once a gap was created, T-34 units moved rapidly, surrounding enemy positions and disrupting attempts to reorganize. This style of warfare mirrored the principles of blitzkrieg. But now, it was being used against Germany. The irony was clear. The strategy that had once defined German success was now being applied by their opponent. And the T-34 was central to this transformation. By late 1944, the cumulative effect of these developments had become undeniable. German forces were retreating across multiple fronts. Soviet forces were advancing toward Germany itself. And the outcome of the war was becoming increasingly certain. The T-34 had played a significant role in this shift. Not as a single decisive factor, but as a consistent and reliable element within a larger system. It had supported defensive operations in the early stages of the war. It had contributed to counter-offensives that slowed and reversed German advances. And it now supported large-scale offensives that pushed toward final victory. This continuity is what made it so important. Because while other weapons and strategies changed, the T-34 remained. It adapted, it improved, and it continued to perform. As the war moved into its final phase, the role of the T-34 would become even more pronounced. Because the final battles would not be about experimentation or adaptation. They would be about execution. And in execution, consistency is everything. The T-34 had proven that it could deliver. And it was about to play its final role. By early 1945, the war in Europe had reached its final and most decisive stage. German forces, once dominant across vast territories, were now retreating on all fronts. Cities that had once served as strategic strongholds were either under siege or already captured. Supply lines were broken, communication was inconsistent, and the ability to coordinate large-scale operations had been severely reduced. The momentum had fully shifted. And once again, the T-34 was at the center of this transformation. But now, its role was no longer about resisting or stabilizing the front. It was about finishing the war. Soviet offensives pushed steadily toward Germany, advancing through Eastern Europe with increasing speed and coordination. Armored units led these advances, breaking through weakened defenses and creating opportunities for infantry and artillery to follow. The T-34-85, now widely deployed, became the backbone of these operations. Its improved firepower allowed it to engage German tanks more effectively, reducing one of the key disadvantages earlier models had faced. Combined with its mobility and reliability, it proved to be an ideal vehicle for offensive operations. German forces, on the defensive, faced a difficult situation. Their remaining tanks, including Panthers and Tigers, were still formidable in combat. In direct engagements, they could still destroy T-34s at long distances and withstand significant damage. But these advantages were increasingly limited by the conditions of the war. There were fewer of them. Fuel was scarce, maintenance was difficult, and replacements were limited. This meant that even though individual German tanks could be highly effective, they could not be deployed in sufficient numbers to influence the overall situation. In contrast, Soviet forces continued to field large numbers of T-34s. This created a consistent pressure across the battlefield. Where one unit advanced, another followed. Where one attack slowed, another continued. This continuity made it difficult for German forces to stabilize their defenses. Because stability requires time, and time was no longer available. As Soviet forces approached Germany itself, the nature of combat began to change. Battles shifted from open terrain to more complex environments, including forests, towns, and eventually cities. Urban combat introduced new challenges for armored units. Narrow streets, limited visibility, and the presence of obstacles reduced the advantages of mobility and range. But even in these conditions, the T-34 adapted. It supported infantry advances, provided direct fire against fortified positions, and maintained pressure on defensive lines. Its versatility allowed it to operate effectively in a variety of roles, from breakthrough operations to close support. This adaptability was critical, because the final stages of the war required flexibility. German forces attempted to resist as effectively as possible. Defensive positions were established, anti-tank weapons were deployed, and remaining armored units were concentrated in key areas. In some engagements, they achieved local successes, slowing Soviet advances and inflicting losses. But these successes were temporary. Because the broader situation continued to deteriorate, Soviet forces maintained pressure, advancing steadily and exploiting weaknesses as they appeared. The ability to recover from losses, supported by strong production and logistics, allowed them to sustain operations even under difficult conditions. The T-34 played a central role in this process. It was not the only factor, but it was one of the most visible. Its presence on the battlefield became a symbol of Soviet momentum. Where T-34 units advanced, progress followed. As the fighting moved closer to Berlin, the intensity increased. The city became the final objective, and both sides understood its significance. German forces concentrated their remaining resources in its defense, while Soviet forces prepared for a final offensive that would bring the war to an end. In this final phase, the role of armored units remained crucial. The T-34 supported the advance into the city, navigating through difficult terrain and engaging in close-range combat. Buildings, rubble, and narrow streets created obstacles, but the tank's design allowed it to operate effectively alongside infantry units. This cooperation between different types of forces was essential. Because urban warfare requires coordination, no single unit can operate effectively on its own. The T-34, integrated into a broader system, continued to perform its role. It provided fire support, it absorbed damage, and it maintained pressure. German defenders fought with determination, using every available resource to slow the advance. Anti-tank weapons were positioned strategically, and remaining armored units were used to counterattack when possible. These efforts made the battle difficult. But they could not change the outcome. Because the factors that had shaped the war over the previous years were still in place. Production, logistics, coordination, and momentum, all of these favored the Soviet side. And the T-34 was a key part of that advantage. By the time Berlin fell, the role of the T-34 in the war was undeniable. It had been present from the early stages of the conflict, where it challenged German superiority. It had contributed to the shift in momentum during the middle years. And it had supported the final offensives that brought the war to an end. This continuity is what made it unique. It was not just a weapon that appeared at a single moment. It was a constant that adapted to changing conditions and remained effective throughout the war. As the fighting came to an end, the story of the T-34 was already becoming part of history. But its significance extended beyond individual battles. It had changed how armored warfare was understood. It had influenced the design of future tanks. And it had demonstrated the importance of balance, simplicity, and scalability. The final chapter of its story, however, was still to be told. Because understanding what it achieved requires understanding what it meant. And that meaning goes beyond the battlefield. It is about how wars are fought, how they are won, and how a single machine can influence both. The T-34 had played its role. And now, the war was ending. But its impact would remain. When the war in Europe finally came to an end in 1945, millions of lives had been changed, entire cities had been destroyed, and the balance of global power had shifted permanently. The conflict had tested not only armies and strategies, but also the limits of technology and industrial capacity. Within this vast and complex history, the T-34 stood out. Not as the largest tank. Not as the most heavily armored. Not even as the most technologically advanced in every aspect. But as one of the most effective. To understand why the T-34 is often described as the tank that changed World War II forever, it is necessary to look beyond individual battles and consider the broader picture. War is not decided by a single moment. It is shaped by patterns, by systems, by the ability to adapt over time. The T-34 fit into this reality perfectly. From its first appearance on the battlefield in 1941, it introduced a new standard for tank design. Its sloped armor demonstrated that protection could be increased without simply adding more weight. Its wide tracks showed that mobility was not just about speed, but about the ability to operate in all conditions. Its balance of firepower, protection, and simplicity created a model that would influence tank design for decades. But design alone was not enough. What made the T-34 truly significant was how it was used. It was produced in large numbers, allowing it to remain a constant presence on the battlefield. It was integrated into a broader system of infantry, artillery, and air support, increasing its effectiveness. And it was adapted over time, improving its capabilities as the war evolved. This combination of design, production, and usage created something more than just a weapon. It created a system. And in modern warfare, systems win wars. German tanks, particularly in the later stages of the conflict, were often superior in specific areas. The Panther and Tiger, for example, featured stronger armor and more powerful guns. In direct engagements, they could outperform the T-34 under the right conditions. But those conditions were not always present. These tanks were complex, difficult to produce, and required significant maintenance. Their numbers were limited, and their impact was constrained by logistical challenges. The T-34, by contrast, was consistent. It could be produced quickly. It could be maintained more easily. And it could be deployed in large numbers. This consistency made it more effective over time. Because war is not just about winning individual battles. It is about sustaining effort, maintaining pressure, and adapting to change. The T-34 excelled in all of these areas. Its impact can be seen in the progression of the war itself. In 1941, it disrupted German expectations and challenged their sense of superiority. In 1942 and 1943, it contributed to the shift from rapid offensives to prolonged conflict. In 1944 and 1945, it supported large-scale advances that pushed German forces back toward their own territory. At each stage, it played a different role. But at every stage, it remained relevant. This adaptability is one of its defining characteristics. Because as the war changed, so did the requirements of the battlefield. And the T-34 was able to meet those requirements. Another important aspect of its legacy is its influence. The principles demonstrated by the T-34, sloped armor, balanced design, and emphasis on production, became standard in future tank development. Countries around the world studied its design, learned from its strengths, and applied those lessons to their own military programs. In this way, its impact extended far beyond World War II. It shaped the future of armored warfare. But perhaps the most important lesson of the T-34 is not technical. It is strategic. It shows that effectiveness in war is not determined by a single factor. Not by firepower alone, not by armor alone, not by speed alone, but by the balance between them, and by how that balance is supported by production, logistics, and coordination. The T-34 achieved that balance. And that is why it succeeded. As the war ended and the world began to rebuild, the story of the T-34 remained a powerful example of how a single design can influence an entire conflict. It was not perfect. It had limitations. It required improvement. But it worked. And in war, what works matters more than what is theoretically superior. The idea that it changed the war forever is not about a single moment of victory. It is about the cumulative effect of its presence. The way it forced adaptation. The way it influenced strategy. And the way it contributed to a shift in momentum that ultimately shaped the outcome. The T-34 did not win the war alone. But without it, the war might have looked very different. And that is what makes it significant. It was not just a tank. It was a turning point. A machine that redefined expectations. And a reminder that in war, success often belongs not to the most advanced, but to the most effective. The tank that changed World War II forever was not the most powerful. It was the one that worked when everything else struggled. And that made all the difference.